The year 2020 is a census year. Under the U.S. Constitution, the federal government must take a census every 10 years. The census is basically a count of every person in the United States. And that simple piece of information has been fundamental to the proper functioning of our government throughout our nation's history. How so? Let's find out. This is the Census in U.S. History. My name is Damon Huss. The story of the census begins at the Constitutional Convention in 1787. The new government designed by the convention's delegates had a bicameral legislative branch, which means there were two lawmaking bodies, the Senate and the House of Representatives. In the Senate, each state had an equal number of 2 representatives apiece, but in the House, the number of representatives depended on the population of each state, and that is where the census comes in. The only way to know how many representatives each state would have, or to apportion the representatives among the states, was to count up the people living in each state. Oh, and this counting of people would also determine how much each state would receive in tax revenue for federally funded programs, but we'll come back to that toward the end of this video. Here is a map of the United States as it existed in July 1787 during the time of the Constitutional Convention. The census seems pretty straightforward. It's just a matter of simple addition to getting a total number of people in the country. But there was a major complication. As we know, not every person living in the United States in 1787 was free. How would the number of enslaved persons be counted? Delegates from the North and South argued about the counting of enslaved people at the Constitutional Convention, finally agreeing to the infamous 3/5 compromise. Slaves would be counted in each census, but only 3/5 of the slave population would be included in a state's total population for the purposes of determining representation and taxation, effectively counting each slave as only 3/5 of a person. So, Article 1, Section 2 of the Constitution stated, "Representatives and direct taxes shall be apportioned among the several states according to their respective numbers by adding the whole number of free persons, those bound to a service term of years, or indentured servants, and 3/5 of, quote, all other persons, unquote, or slaves, for the total number in each state." Indians not taxed was a curious phrase that was not defined in any law. Only much later in 1860 would census takers be instructed that Indians not taxed included American Indians who had renounced tribal authority. And in 1940, the federal government did away with this category altogether. Calculating the number of representatives for each state served one other crucial function: determining how many votes each state would have in the Electoral College, the body that officially chooses the President of the United States. Each state's number of electors is equal to the total number of representatives and senators from that state. Every presidential election has relied on an accurate count of electors in the Electoral College. We'll point you to more resources about the Electoral College at the end of this video. How did the census work? Article 1 also prescribed that the first census would happen within 3 years of the first meeting of the new Congress, and every 10 years from there on out. So the first census was taken in 1790, and every census since then has occurred in a year ending in a 0, which is why 2020 is a census year, and 2030 will be the next census year. The first census in 1790 counted 3,929,625 individuals living in the original 13 states and its territories. The slave population listed was over 694,280 people, or roughly 1 in every 6 people in the whole United States. The Constitution does not describe how the census would be taken. Congress would have the task of passing laws in order to set up the procedures for just how to count so many people accurately, as well as to add and modify the questions on the census over the course of our nation's history. Census takers went door to door until 1960, when the census questionnaires were first mailed to U.S. households. But going back, between 1790 and 1840, the census counted everyone, but not everyone was named in the census. only the name of the head of each household was actually recorded. In 1800, Congress added age categories to the census, but for free white persons only in each household. The 1850 census listed all free persons by name for the first time. In other words, all free members of households, white and non-white alike, were named in this census. Fugitive slaves who had escaped a slave state to seek freedom elsewhere were counted, except they were still grouped in with the enslaved population. The Civil War would change the way the census was taken for the rest of our history. The Civil War ended in 1865 with the defeat of the Southern Confederacy and also marked the end of legal slavery in the United States. The 13th Amendment made slavery unconstitutional. But what about the Three-Fifths Compromise? The 14th Amendment repealed the Three-Fifths Compromise. The first census taken after the Civil War was in 1870, and it was the first census in U.S. history in which freed slaves in the South would be counted as full persons. Many censuses after 1870 would both reflect and cause major changes in the country. Let's take a look at some. In 1910, President William Howard Taft issued a proclamation assuring Americans that census data would be confidential and not shared with other government agencies, even law enforcement. According to the U.S. Census Bureau, during World War I, federal law nonetheless allowed the Census Bureau director to disregard any privacy restrictions and use information for the military draft. Later, in 1929, Congress passed a law allowing only the release of statistical information from the census and keeping data on individuals strictly confidential. The 1910 census also marked a decline in the number of immigrants from northwestern European countries like England, and an increase of immigrants from Eastern and Southern European countries like Russia and Italy, and from Asian countries like China, Japan, and the Philippines. The trends continued in the 1920 census. Some people and policymakers saw these new immigration trends as a threat. The trends spurred a backlash of nativism, and they spurred lawmakers to pass the Immigration Act of 1924. This law established a quota system that discriminated against immigrants from Eastern and Southern Europe and barred all immigration from Asian countries. The law was not repealed until 1965. Here is a census taker called an enumerator, conducting an interview in Alaska in 1940. After the U.S. entered World War II in 1941, the government made heavy use of 1940 census data to estimate military manpower and industrial resource needs. Congress also passed a law repealing the confidentiality of census data, which was then used to identify and incarcerate individuals of Japanese ancestry, citizens and non-citizens alike, in internment camps. The camp at Manzanar in California is pictured here. Congress would put the confidentiality policy back into law in 1954, and that remains the law today. The government cannot access anyone's individual information from the census. The 1970 census revealed that out of a population of over 200 million people, over 25 million Americans lived below the poverty level. This prompted Congress to pass anti-poverty programs like supplemental security income and the Earned Income Tax Credit, which are still in effect today. Census statistics were also used to detect discrimination against minorities and women in such areas as employment and to enforce voting rights. After 2010, census data showed the population of the United States had reached 308.7 million, a 9.7% increase from the previous census of 2000. Census Day 2020 fell on April 1st, but if your household did not complete it by that date, don't worry. Your household can complete the census after that date. And 2020 marks the first time everyone can complete the census questionnaire online. We have included the link under this video. From May 27th to August 14th in 2020, Census takers can follow up with the households where no one has yet filled out the census questionnaire. As Article 1 of the Constitution and the 14th Amendment state, the census is a counting of all persons, citizens and non-citizens alike. And remember, since 1954, census information remains confidential by law, so there is no reason not to fill out the form. But there is every reason to go through with filling out the form. First, recall at the beginning of this video why the Constitutional Convention deliberated about the census in the first place. Your state's seats in the House of Representatives depend on accurate census information. The more people in a state, the more representatives in Congress. Equally important, federal and state governments rely on census information to budget funding for years following each census. And this includes funding for the disabled, senior citizens, veterans, and the poor. Census 2020 data will be crucial for these governments to budget money for effectively tackling public health crises as well, like the COVID-19 coronavirus pandemic. City governments and private industries use census data to plan where to build new hospitals and health clinics, as well as housing projects and schools. Thanks for watching. This video has been a production of Constitutional Rights Foundation and is made possible by our generous donors. For more information and a classroom lesson on the census and the controversy surrounding the immigration question that the U.S. Supreme Court rejected in 2019, see CRF's lesson, The Census in U.S. History, in the links below.